Guten Tag, APUSH. We have a new video today. It's the Bee's Knees by the big cheese himself, Mr. Linegar. Let's make history today as we jaw over Unit 5, Day 5. But first, let's do our daily punishment. I bought a boat because it was on for sale. I bought a boat because it was for sale. Key terms for today are dun dun dun. The Great Migration, Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Dubois, George Washington Carver, the Tuskegee Institute, Old Immigrants, New Immigrants, Jane Addams, the Whole House, Johns Hopkins University, Florence Kelley, Henry George, Edward Bellamy, Jack London, Carrie Nation, Naswa, Free Love of 1871, Normal Schools, the Chautauqua Study at Home, the Moral Act, Ida B. Wells, the Social Gospel Movement, the American Protective Association, the Immigration Restriction League, the YMCA, Salvation Army, Joseph Pulitzer, William Randolph Hearst, dime novels, P.T. Barnum and Bailey, Vaudeville, Buffalo Bill Cody, and Anne Oakley. We're going to go over the effects of urbanization and major inventions in the cities. We'll be talking about life in the cities and social characteristics in today's video. We'll talk about racial and immigration changes, nativism, anti-immigrants, anti-immigration feeling in the Gilded Age, culture and leisure pursuits during the Gilded Age, self-improvement and education changes during the Gilded Age. So let's talk about the urban frontier. In the during the Gilded Age, you're going to have the first skyscrapers being built. We're going to have the first 10-story building being built, and later skyscrapers will be built in America. You'll have elevators be built, electric trolleys. You have new industrial jobs, electricity, indoor plumbing, telephones. You have Sears catalog, which was originally a catalog that people could buy from, and the goods would be shipped to them. They eventually became the company called Sears. Montgomery Ward's was another company formed during this time that would sell consumer products. There was problems with waste disposal at first. They didn't have a lot of cities didn't have like a made system for sewage disposal, which is gross. There was high crime in a lot of the urban frontiers in the cities. Terrible smell, disease. And you will start to see slums being formed in some of these cities where you have like ghettos with people with the same ethnic group or religion, like Chinatown. There was slums for Irish people and Italians in some of the bigger cities or ghettos. Urban frontier. Let's talk about life for African Americans during the during the Gilded Age. During this time, African Americans will be moving north in the Great Migration. The Great Migration actually happens from around 1910 to 1970, so kind of towards the end of this unit. But you're going to have around 6 million African Americans moving from the south to the north and the west from 1910 to 1970 to get jobs in the north, to work in factories and stuff. This is actually going to lead to a backlash, which we'll talk about next unit, where a lot of white people, a lot of white Northerners weren't happy about blacks because they thought they were going to take their jobs, and also they're low-key racist. And the KKK will become a big deal in the North. Obviously, a lot of the reason a lot of these African Americans are leaving the South is because of racism and to get better jobs. Some of the big African American leaders was Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington is going to be an African American civil rights leader. He focused on economic independence. He wanted African Americans to not worry about political rights. The Southerners are not going to give them the right to vote. But if they get a good job and they make a lot of money, then eventually from economics, you'll get political rights. He forms the Tuskegee Institute, which was an institute for black people to work on useful trades, like to be like carpenters and stuff. One of the professors at the Tuskegee Institute was George Washington Carver. He was the one that found all his uses for peanut butter, peanut oil, stuff like that. Another African-American person that kind of disagreed with Booker T. Washington was W.E.B. Du Bois. He's going to help found the NAACP in 1910, which is the major civil rights organization for African Americans. He demanded complete political equality for African Americans. He was more radical. He didn't want to wait. He basically accused Booker T. Washington of being a sellout to the white man. Ida B. Wells is going to focus on anti-lynching laws and women's suffrage during this time. She's a female African-American civil rights advocate. Dubois is eventually going to leave America. He kind of gives up on the American dream. He becomes a socialist and spends the rest of his life in the 1950s and 60s in Africa, in Ghana. Here's a picture of Dubois versus Booker T. Washington. They were not friends. All right, let's talk about immigration. We talked about this before. You have 2 million immigrants coming to America from 1850 to 1870, which was about the population of Nebraska. In the early 1800s, we'd already talked about this before. You had the old immigrants. They were from Northern and Western Europe. They spoke English and German, mostly Irish and German. There was some discrimination against them, but it wasn't a huge deal. So for the old immigrants, like there was the Know Nothing Party being formed, but for the most part, they faced discrimination, but it wasn't as bad as what the new immigrants will face. The new immigrants are going to be immigrants coming to America in the late 1800s. They're mostly coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. They're made up of Greeks, Croatians, Italians, Poles, Slovakians, Jews. A lot of Jews are fleeing Europe because of pogroms, violence against Jews. Many of them will come to the U.S. A lot will come to New York City. They'll create tailoring shops. They're not going to be well received. Some of them will form private schools like Catholic and Hebrew schools. They'll have foreign language newspapers. Some of the discrimination against the new immigrants is for a couple of reasons. Some of the racist Americans thought they weren't assimilating into American life. They were still keeping their foreign language, their foreign religions. They had darker colored skin if they were from Southern and Eastern Europe. So even though they're white, they're not as white as the old immigrants. And some of the new immigrants coming to America are going to be more radical. They're going to be anarchist and communist. This shows some shipping of new immigrants to Ellis Island. And they're waiting to be boarded and to come to the country. So there will be a reaction against the new immigrants. And Congress will actually try to pass laws to limit immigration in 1882. So, for example, the Congress will pass the Chinese Exclusion Act, which we talked about before. Congress will also pass laws to try to limit immigration. They'll try to limit it that if you're a criminal or if you're a poor person or if you're insane or if you have a disease, you cannot come to the country. They're not going to put quotas in yet. That won't be until the 1920s. But this is when we start to really get stronger anti-immigration laws being passed in America. There were some organizations being formed during this time that were meant to be pro-nativist, anti-immigrant. The American Protective Association is one of them. The next one is the Immigration Restriction League, which is going to be one of the leaders was Henry Cabot Lodge, who we'll talk about. These were nativist, anti-immigrant organizations. During this time, some of the churches will try to help out the poor. The Salvation Army was formed in order to help out poor people. There will be a new type of Christianity called Christian Scientist, which was founded by Mary Baker Eddy. They try to combine Christianity and science. They said Christianity could heal sickness with prayer. The YMCA was formed, which was meant to be a gathering of people, have free and cheap, like different things like pools, like outdoor games, stuff like that. And there will be a church movement in America by some Protestant pastors called the Social Gospel Movement. The Social Gospel Movement is different than the Gospel of Wealth. The Social Gospel Movement is trying to apply Jesus' teachings to how we treat the poor and how business should be run. So they said what they Social Gospel Movement believed was they talked about how Jesus was always for the poor. He always supported, he always opposed people being persecuted and people being exploited. So Christianity needs to like adopt those things and give better working conditions and treat the lower class better. It tried to tie your salvation to doing good works for the community at large. So reaction to immigration, the new immigrants is going to be very poor in America. You will have boss politics, like we talked about, like the boss politics before, like the Tweed Ring, where a lot of the those different like boss politics will be exploiting the workers. For boss politics, you have those like political machines, where like some local politicians will control parts of a city. They'll do bribes. They'll get new immigrants they'll get them a job at a factory. In return, they expect them to work for them. So the new immigrants will be exploited. There will be some anti-sweatshop laws created to protect women. And one of the big things created during this time was the settlement houses. Settlement houses, the big person you should know for this is Jane Addams. The biggest settlement house she created is the Hull House. This was meant to give a place to live for women that immigrated to America. It was able to provide them for childcare when they're working in the factories. It helped teach them English and provided them for cultural activities. So it was also meant to assimilate them. But Jane Addams is one of the more important reformers you should know. And the big settlement house she created is called the Hull House, helped them settle in the country. Florence Kelly is going to fight for women, children, blacks, and consumers. She'll create the way for women. She's going to fight really against she's going to fight for like child laws for children, stopping the exploitation of children. So eventually, in the 1910s, Congress will pass laws against child labor, and really a lot of the person responsible for a lot of those laws will be Florence Kelly. There is a lot of prejudice against the new immigrants, the Southern and Eastern Europeans. People feared socialism and communism and anarchy. Also, they were worried that they would work for cheaper wages and take away the jobs of nativist Americans. Here's the Hull House. There were new changes in learning during this time. You have tax-supported elementary schools. Elementary education was compulsory in most states. Remember, states were the ones that determined education. There's going to be more high schools. A lot of schools gave textbooks for free now. There were normal schools. Normal schools were actual teacher training. Before this time, you didn't really have to train to be a teacher. I know some of you probably think you still don't have to train to be a teacher. There was also called the Chautauqua Study at Home School, and that's where you would like the Chautauqua Study at Home thing. What that was you would you can go to a private. You could study at home. You could be given like pamphlets mailed to you so you can learn on your own. Also, some lecturers would travel around the country and you could listen to them and kind of educate yourself. So it was an informal way of education. There will be new colleges. There'll be some HBCUs like Howard University and Hampton Institute. You have Atlanta University. During the Civil War, the Morrill Act will be passed. The Morrill Act gave land to be granted to colleges, and this is where you're going to get some agricultural colleges like Texas A&M, and it gave generous land grants to create colleges, agricultural mechanization colleges. There's going to be an increase in private colleges and technical schools. We also have the first graduate school, Johns Hopkins University, for PhD. Newspapers during this time. In the late 1800s, you have Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. They're both going to be focusing on sensationalism, trying to sell newspapers by making sensational topics, really trying to use exaggeration. This is also called yellow journalism. William Randolph Hearst had the New York World. His father made millions from mining. His father was from San Francisco. Not very wholesome. They both practiced yellow journalism. Their goal was to really sell newspapers as much as possible. They weren't really interested in whether it was the truth or not. Here's an example of yellow journalism, sensationalism. During this time, we will have other types of literature. You'll have some socialist literature. Henry George will write Progress and Poverty, which wanted to do 100% tax on profits to ease poverty. He argued against the misdistribution of wealth. Edward Bellamy wrote a science fiction socialist novel looking backwards. During this, in this novel, Bellamy also argued to nationalize big businesses to serve the public need. And this will sell millions of copies. That's Henry George. Otherwise, we have dime novels. Dime novels were cheap novels that were sold in like convenience stores and by newspapers. They were really not like, there wasn't a huge plot about them, like sometimes like cowboys and Indians. But that's a new type of literature in America during this time, dime novels. You have other people. You have one of the famous books is Ben-Hur, which was a metaphor in Christ story. Walt Whitman's poetry became really famous during this time. There was a lot of Horatio Alger books. Horatio Alger was a poor person that became rich, so rags to riches. You have Emily Dickinson, my boy Mark Twain, like Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer will all become very popular. Bret Hart's going to be a famous author. Stephen Crane writes The Red Badge of Courage, which is about the American Civil War. Henry James. Jack London is going to be very famous during this time. He does Call of the Wild, about the wolves. Here's an example of a dime novel. As you can see, it's not very like, it's not like the Aeneid or the Odyssey or anything like that. There's Jack London. For women, here's what's going on for women. People will become more loose sexually in the late 1800s. There was even a period in 1871 when it was called the free love period of 1871. I don't want you to get like any ideas. This is not the same as the 1960s, but there is a little bit of loosening of values during this time. Economic freedom for women, remember they're Gibson girls, will encourage some sexual freedom. Marriages will delay and the birth rate will drop. You're going to start to have more reform movements for women's suffrage. We've talked about suffrage before. The first big suffrage group will be formed, the NASWA. This is the National American Women's Suffrage Association. It's going to be formed by Carrie Catt. And she was kind of a conservative leader. She tied the need to vote, but she didn't try to go against the gender norms of society. She said women could still be homemakers, blah, blah, blah. She linked the women of Nassau to traditional roles of women. It wasn't so challenging. Some territories even gave women the right to vote. Wyoming was the first territory to give the women the right to vote in the late 1800s. During this time, some women will also be for prohibition. The idea is the barroom kept men and women in poverty. Also, the bar and alcohol made men abusive. Carrie Nation, who we've mentioned a couple times, is going to smash beer bottles. Eventually, in 1920, I think, or 1919, Congress will pass the 18th Amendment, which will prohibit the consumption of alcohol, prohibition. Lastly, let's talk about some of the art stuff going on. You have P.T. Barnum and James Bailey. They're going to get formed together, and they're going to create the first circuses, traveling circuses, where you have like the elephants, the clowns, and all that stuff. Vaudevilles were shows that were done inside cities and inside theaters. Vaudevilles were really talented. They would do jokes, acrobats. They would sing. They kind of did a little bit of everything. Vaudeville shows are actually pretty fire. They're pretty awesome. You had Wild West shows led by Buffalo Bill Cody in the late 1800s. Bill Cody would travel around and have outdoor performances. People would practice shooting guns. There would be some old Native Americans that led rebellions against America where they would like do mock battles, like horse races and stuff like that. Ann Oakley was one of the performers in Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows. She was a pretty good shot. Also, baseball will be created during this time. There's Ann Oakley. She's a beast. And here's one of the Buffalo Bill shows. These were all real Native Americans. They actually, a lot of the people that Bill Cody took were like former rebels against the American government. A lot of them were poor after this, so they kind of like are being exploited and like, meant to dress up and pretend to fight against the U.S. government again. God, it's so demeaning. Anyways, kiddos, that's all I have for you for today's video. Until next time, deuces. Deuces, yeah.